Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Peppis, Interim Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is Mark Alfano. Alfano is Assistant Professor of Philosophy at the UO. His interests lie in ethics, epistemology, Nietzsche, philosophy of mind, and experimental philosophy. Alfano joined the UO faculty in 2013 after postdoctoral fellowships at the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Studies and the Princeton University Center for Human Values. His first book, Character as Moral Fiction, was published in 2013. Alfano will be an Oregon Humanities Center Faculty Research Fellow in fall 2014. His fellowship is made possible by the Vice President for Research, Innovation, and Graduate Education Completion Award. Thank you, Mark, for coming on the show.
Thanks.
As I just mentioned, you work on ethics, epistemology, Nietzsche, philosophy of mind, which all seem like interests we would expect from a philosopher. But what is experimental philosophy?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and experimental methods have been the sort of thing that philosophers have been interested in for quite a long time. So Hume included the word experimental in the title of one of his books. John Stuart Mill talked about experiments in living. Nietzsche talks about himself as the great experimenter. But when they talk about experimentation, it's not clear that they're talking specifically about scientific experimentation as we understand it in the 20th and 21st century. So what distinguishes the new experimental philosophy, if you'll allow me to call it that, is the idea that we don't just look to the sciences for evidence or data or other things to interpret, but that we actually get our hands dirty and collect data ourselves. Scientists distinguish between proper experiments on the one hand, which involve randomizing participants to condition, and studies on the other hand, which don't involve that. You sometimes end up running studies if you can't actually do the randomization or if it would be unethical to do the randomization. So for instance, you can't really randomize people to their genders. But experimental philosophers starting in the 1990s and going right through to today have been looking at philosophical concepts from an experimental point of view. So some of the early studies were conducted by people like Sean Nichols, Stephen Stitch, Joshua Knobe, Joshua Green, and one of the sort of most famous ones spawned what's known as the Knobe effect, or the side effect effect. So I'll put it to you this way. Imagine the following scenario. The vice president of a company is talking to the chairman of the board, and the chairman says, well, we have this new idea. We're going to institute, or we're thinking of instituting a plan, and we're quite sure of two things about it. First, it's definitely going to increase our profits, and in addition, it's going to harm the environment. And the VP says, you know what, I don't care at all about the environment. All I care about is making as much money as possible. Let's do it. Now you present people with this scenario and then you tell them that sure enough, when they went ahead with it, they made the money and they also harmed the environment. And you ask people, did the VP intentionally harm the environment? And most people will say yes. But then if you tell them the same story except that the side effect is that they help the environment, people will say that he didn't intentionally help the environment, which seems like this very strange thing, because you might have thought that when we evaluate people's moral behavior, first we figure out what they did and whether they did it intentionally, and then we make an evaluation, right? So if you happen to be standing on my foot and I know that you're doing it unintentionally, I'm going to be much less annoyed than if I know that you're standing on my foot intentionally. But what seems to be happening with the Knobe effect, or the side effect, or at least this is what people thought at first, was that what seems to be happening is that the moral evaluation comes first and biases or influences in some way the attribution of intentionality. So that's the sort of thing that experimental philosophers are interested in. They're interested in how our different concepts are influenced by what might seem to be irrelevant factors or influences, and they're interested in experimenting with very slightly different ways of setting things up to see whether people's minds will change.
So this emphasis on empirical observation, experiments, and also the orientation that you clearly have towards questions of psychology makes experimental philosophy sound sort of social sciencey. So in what sense is it philosophical? In what sense is it a humanities activity?
Right. So my friend Azim Sharif, who's an assistant professor here, likes to say that experimental philosophy is just social psychology with worse methods and better theory. And one of my advisors from my graduate career at CUNY, David Rosenthal, is fond of saying that a philosophy paper is just the discussion section that a psychology paper should have had. So I think that what's going on with this new experimental philosophy is that people wished that there would be experimental evidence, empirical evidence that they could draw on for various aspects of theorizing that they wanted to engage in, both in moral psychology and in philosophy of mind and in epistemology and so on. And they decided, well, if it's not there already, we're going to go get it. We're going to do it ourselves. Now, some of the early studies were very badly constructed, but then, of course, in any new field, you have a lot of very bad stuff to begin with. And I think that the method is sort of coming into its own at this point. There's a lot of collaborative stuff between philosophers and psychologists. Philosophers are getting well enough trained in the scientific methodology themselves and in the statistical analysis that they can do it on their own if they want to. And the basic idea is that, at least in some areas of philosophy, the answer to a conceptual question will turn on what happens to be an empirical truth. And so what experimental philosophers are doing is just connecting those two up.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So I understand that experimental philosophy is controversial. Why?
Is it still?
Well, some of what I read when we were researching for the interview suggested as well.
Yeah. So in philosophy, we sometimes distinguish between what are called a priori truths and a posteriori truths. So a priori truths are things that you're supposed to be able to know without any particular experience. Now, of course, everybody has experiences, so it's not like there's a claim that people are brains in vats or that they're Platonic souls without bodies or anything like that. But the idea is that, for instance, simply just by inspecting the contents of our concepts, we can make inferences about how they're connected. We can draw conclusions that have necessary force to them. On the other hand, a posteriori truths are supposed to be the sort of thing that you can only establish if you have some particular experience. And the people who criticize experimental philosophy criticize it because they think that real philosophy only does the a priori stuff. Now, I happen to think that there probably aren't any a priori truths in the first place. So if they're right about what real philosophy is, then there is no real philosophy. But that's a sort of extra question because everybody accepts that there are at least some a posteriori truths. And it seems like, for instance, in ethics, knowing what sorts of creatures we are, knowing what sorts of judgments we are capable of making, knowing what sorts of tendencies to behavior we're capable of, will influence the kinds of virtues, the kinds of right actions, and the kinds of policies that we recommend.
So how did you come to be interested in experimental philosophy?
Through Nietzsche, actually. As an undergraduate, I OD'd on philosophical history. Most of my courses were in history of philosophy, and I had a special love of Nietzsche. And what I think is most interesting about Nietzsche is that when he does his big grand theories, they're usually preposterous. But when he's making subtle psychological observations about people's motivations, about self-deception, about the intricacies of moral judgments and behavior, he's just remarkably insightful. And so that got me interested in moral psychology more generally, and I started looking at some of the empirical work and found out that, at least as far as I could tell, some of it actually seemed to support certain things that Nietzsche was talking about. For instance, the pervasive influence of affect or emotion on perception, on moral judgment, on non-moral judgment, just regular judgments about facts, on behavior, and it's often kind of imperceptible, but that's what's happening to us. So when you get interested in a topic from a historical point of view, you can stay there, that's fine, but another thing to do is to sort of see, well, this is very fascinating. Is it right? Is it true? And that's how I sort of got interested in experimental philosophy. Oddly enough, Joshua Knobe, who I mentioned earlier, the founder, the discoverer of the Knobe effect, is also sort of interested in this stuff in part because of his route through Nietzsche. He was about to write a dissertation on Nietzsche at Princeton, and at the last minute switched to experimental philosophy.
Interesting, interesting. So your recently published book is titled Character as Moral Fiction. Can you explain what you mean by that title? In what sense is character a moral fiction?
Yeah, so to see what the problem is, it might be useful to start with the fiction aspect of it. We tend to think of our friends and our families and colleagues as people who have various character traits. They're honest, they're trustworthy, they're kind, they're compassionate, they're generous, and so on. I've recently been reading hundreds, actually thousands now, of obituaries to see what people say about their dead relatives. And if they say anything at all other than just, the person was born, they lived here, and then they died there, they make some kind of character trait attribution. The most common in Eugene are being a good friend, being a good family member, being a Christian, and being a Ducks fan.
What a surprise.
So we have this idea that people are virtuous, that they have character traits like this. But a lot of evidence from social psychology might lead you to worry that we're wrong in making these attributions in most cases, or at least that we're unjustified. Because it seems like seemingly trivial and sort of morally irrelevant factors influence our behavior quite a bit. And not just our behavior, but also the way we deliberate, the sorts of things that we're capable of seeing from a moral point of view, and so on. So one particularly well-known experiment was conducted by Darley and Batson at the Princeton Theological Seminary. You might be familiar with this one. It's known as the Good Samaritan experiment. So in the experiment, they took a bunch of seminarians and told them that they had to go across campus and give a presentation, either on the parable of the Good Samaritan or a presentation on how to get a job after you finish up with seminary. And then they randomized them to be either in a hurry or not. And along the way, this is exactly, of course, what happens in the parable of the Good Samaritan. Along the way, there was somebody by the side of the road sort of moaning and looking like he was in distress. And what they waited to see was whether everybody would help or only some people would help, and whether sort of thinking about the very moral content that was important to them in that situation, whether they realized it or not, or instead their degree of hurry made a difference as to whether they helped. And it turns out that the vast majority of them helped when they weren't in a rush, regardless of what they were about to talk about, and regardless of their religious convictions. Whereas those who were in a rush, almost none of them helped, regardless of what they were about to talk about and regardless of their religious convictions. Now, that's just one sort of emblematic study. There are literally thousands of other studies that point in this sort of direction. They seem to suggest that we can be very, very generous and kind to each other, and we can also be immensely callous to each other. And the thing that makes the difference isn't sort of what kind of person you are in many cases. The thing that seems to make the difference in many cases is something like whether you're in a hurry, whether you found a dime in the coin return of a payphone. We don't really have payphones anymore, but people know what I'm talking about. Whether the room is bright or dim, whether the sound in the room is at a sort of a medium level or a low level, and so on. So if you think of someone who's, say, honest, their honesty shouldn't depend on whether they're in a bright room or not. If you think of someone as kind, their kindness shouldn't depend on whether they just found a dime. So the fact that many people, perhaps most people, are susceptible to these kinds of influences kind of makes us worry that the kinds of character traits that we tend to assume that we ourselves have and that our friends and our family have are just fictions. So that's the sort of worry, and Gilbert Harman and John Doris were the first to sort of really put this problem on the map. And in my book, I argue that they're more or less right, but that we should keep attributing character traits to each other, at least virtues, at least when we do so and it's somewhat plausible and we do it publicly, because there's also some pretty compelling evidence that people tend to live up to the attributions that are made to them. The attributions work kind of like self-fulfilling prophecies. So if you call me honest, or if you call me kind, or generous, or environmentally minded, or whatever the trait might be, I'll tend to behave more like that in the future, especially if you do it in front of other people and sort of changes the way I think about myself. But this also means, I think, that we should be extremely careful about attributing vices to each other, because there's also some evidence that that these attributions function as self-fulfilling prophecies as well. So telling someone that they're stingy, for instance, will lead them to be less generous in the future than they would have been otherwise. So it's a kind of mixed or asymmetric view. We should continue attributing virtues, or even lower our standards for doing so slightly, whereas we should be extremely wary of attributing vices. We should raise our evidential standards for doing that.
So if character is fictional in this sense, significantly the result of environmental or social influences or suggestion, is there a place for free will or the individual agent to determine their own character?
So it seems to me that character gets built up in a kind of external way, and that it becomes partly internalized, but it's always kind of scaffolded or structured by the social context. So in more recent work, I've been exploring what I call the friendship model of virtue. Friendship is interesting because it's essentially social. You can't just be a friend. You can be friendly all on your own, but you can't be a friend all on your own. There needs to be somebody else for you to be a friend, namely your friend. And friends have these characteristic attitudes towards each other. So they think well of each other, they wish each other well for their own sakes, they wish each other well for in virtue of their good character, or at least what they take to be their good character. And they have relevant sort of second-order attitudes. So if we're friends, not only do I wish you well, I can do that if I'm just benevolent, but I think of myself as your friend, and I think of you as my friend, and I probably even know that you think of me as your friend. So there's this sort of second-order and even third-order and fourth-order attitude between us. I think that virtues might work somewhat in the same way. So there's an internal component where, say, I think of myself as kind, just like I could think of myself as someone's friend. But I also know that you think of me as kind, and I know that you know that I know that you think of me as kind, and so on. So the idea is that, yes, there is a sort of core internal aspect to character, but there's also a sort of structured social aspect to it.
So among the large number of projects you're working on is a theory about desire and preference. Can you tell us a little bit about that one?
Sure. So I got interested in this because preferences are ethically important in a number of ways. So if you're going to be, for instance, benevolent, then you need to wish people well, meaning that you wish that benefits be conferred on them. Well, what does it mean to benefit someone? Well, it's something like to get them what they need or what they want, or what they would want if they were better informed, something like that. you might think, if you're a utilitarian, that the right thing to do is the thing that maximizes the satisfaction of preferences. You might think that social policies are wise or prudent to the extent that they don't thwart people's preferences, and so on. So preferences are really normatively important, the sort of thing that we care about in ethics. And so I started to get worried about this by some research in behavioral economics, which suggests that preferences are squishier than we might have expected. They can be flipped. They seem to be almost indeterminate in some cases. And the sorts of things that flip them, the sorts of things that get somebody who initially seems to prefer A to B to instead prefer B to A, seem to be kind of irrelevant. They're not good reasons to change your mind. This sort of research, actually a lot of it was conducted here by Paul Slovic and other psychologists. And in the ensuing decades, it sort of spawned an entire field of behavioral economics. So one sort of very recent example of this kind of thing, which I think is especially worrisome from an ethical point of view, has to do with what's called choice blindness. So suppose I have two pictures of different faces, and I ask you which one you prefer, and you point to this one. I say, okay, so tell me why you liked this face. And when I put my hands down, I did this little card trick, and I switched it. So you're now looking at the face you said you dispreferred. Most people will just give you some reasons. They won't say, oh, actually, I think I liked the other one, or anything like that. And then if you give them an opportunity later to say, look at the faces again, they'll go with the one that you told them they liked rather than the one that they actually said that they liked in the first place. Now, that's not that worrisome because strangers' faces, no big deal. But you can do the same thing with people's political preferences. So you ask them on a scale of 1 to 9, do you think that prostitution should be legal? 9 is completely agree, 1 is completely disagree. And then you have them go through this whole survey, and when they come back to it and you ask them some questions about it, the 1s and the 9s have been switched. So that if they initially said that they strongly agreed, now it says that they strongly disagree. Or if they initially said that they somewhat disagreed, now it says that they somewhat agreed. And you ask people, okay, well, why do you think this? Why is this your policy preference? And they'll just give you reasons. They'll just make something up. So this sort of thing, I think, is extremely worrisome because if what we're supposed to be doing is with our policies or when we act rightly is in some way guided by people's preferences, then there have to be preferences there in the first place to do the guiding. And so I've been working a bit on the extent of this problem to see, which preferences can be flipped, how strong they have to be before they can't be flipped anymore. Presumably, if I offered you a choice between, as Eddie Izzard, the comedian, puts it, cake or death, I couldn't get you to flip that preference. But it seems like with some fairly important things like preferences over political policies, people's preferences can be reversed in this way. So that's a source of ongoing research.
So you run a philosophy blog, Philosophy and Other Thoughts. What makes a blog an appealing way for you to share your ideas? What does that medium provide for you?
Philosophy blogs really took off in the last decade or so. And I think one of the reasons for that is just the abominable turnaround times at philosophy journals. There are some journals where you could submit a paper and not hear back from them for 18, 20 months. So if you're in grad school and you're worried that you're not going to have any kind of exposure at all when you try to find a job in philosophy, then one way to sort of respond to that is to tell people what you think in some more informal context. So I think that's one reason why well, certainly one reason why I started blogging and also a reason why quite a few others do it. But it's also nice to have a kind of informal philosophical conversation. Philosophy can get pretty easily bogged down in distinctions that almost no one cares about, in minutiae that seem kind of irrelevant, in epicycles on epicycles on epicycles, isms and things like that. And when you're blogging, you can keep it short and sweet, and you can be sort of direct. I think that's one of the really nice things about philosophy blogging. I guess the last thing that, in my particular case, is I've recently been doing a lot of stuff that is best represented graphically, and philosophy journals don't tend to print certainly in color. So since a lot of the stuff that I've been working on my blog has these sort of color representations of, for instance, people's values, the blog is a good place to get that out.
So your rabbit, Nori, regularly appears on your blog. Has she informed your philosophical work in any way?
I didn't expect to be asked about Nori. The one thing I can say about that is I've recently started thinking more about the emotions. And I'll even be teaching a grad seminar next year titled The Emotions. And one of the things that kind of got me thinking about this was speculating about which emotions various species are capable of. So it seems fairly clear to me that rabbits are capable of fear. It seems fairly clear that they're capable of joy. They seem capable of anger, actually, which is sort of adorable, given that at least mine weighs only 4 pounds, but not really any other emotions. And then as you sort of progress from rabbits to more and more sophisticated mammals, like higher apes, and bonobos and things like that, capuchin monkeys, you get more and more emotions. And I think that this contributes immensely to our moral lives. Frans de Waal has shown, for instance, that capuchin monkeys will reject unfair payments, and they'll do so out of it seems almost like out of a sense of moral outrage. So,
well, yeah. That's an interesting way for us to wrap up the interview, talking about capuchin monkeys and rabbits. Thank you, Mark, for joining us today. I've been speaking with Mark Alfano, Assistant Professor of Philosophy at the U of O and author of Character as Moral Fiction. Alfano will be on an Oregon Humanities Center Faculty Research Fellow in the fall of 2014. Thanks for watching.